Is boredom extinct? And have we just slowly been brainwashed into becoming these dopaminergic zombies? I mean, no one even talks on the subway anymore. Everyone's just too busy reading the newspaper.
So today, social media detoxes, silent retreats, meditation is being pushed almost like the fad diets of the early 2000s. But are things really that bad? And are they even that different? Is boredom actually extinct, or have we just never really been that bored? There's this book called Sailing Alone Around the World, which is written by this guy called Joshua Slocum, who was the first person ever to sail alone around the entire world back in the late 1800s. And there's a particular paragraph within that book where he speaks to some of the boredom that he experienced during that trip. My memory worked with startling power. The ominous, the insignificant, the great, the small, the wonderful, the commonplace, all appeared before my mental vision in magical succession. Pages of my history were recalled which had been so long forgotten that they seemed to belong to a previous existence. And so I bring this up not only to brag about the fact that I've actually read a book, but also just to illustrate the point that even back in the freaking 1800s, this guy, Joshua Slocum, still got significant clarity from boredom. And it kind of hints at the fact that back on land, living his normal life, he wouldn't have spent too much time being bored. And to me, this is just such a powerful paragraph from that book, because within it, I think he describes exactly the reason why we should pursue boredom. And I think that's because boredom gives our brain the space to catch up. I think the reason for this, or the culprit behind this, is the same culprit that's behind why people are looking for these social media detoxes or silent retreats and meditation. It all seems to boil down to this one common culprit, and it's something that's been very recently thrown into the spotlight, so it's something that I think most of you have already heard of. And this common culprit is dopamine.
Dopamine, dopamine, dopamine,
Dopamine, dopamine, dopamine,
dopamine, dopamine, dopamine, dopamine, dopamine, dopamine.
And so dopamine seems to be the molecule responsible for one of the most fascinating contradictions of our time. The dopamine contradiction is that dopamine is the productivity molecule that makes us procrastinate. But if you understand this contradiction, you can actually use boredom to invert it. And so how can one molecule basically make us do these seemingly contradictory things? The reason for that is that dopamine helps generate desire to take an action. And that action could be to continue checking for another reel on Instagram, or to get started on that big project that you need to do for work. And dopamine can be released for several different things and for several different reasons, but one of those reasons is for the anticipation of a future reward, which is one of the reasons why it's so difficult to stay away from your phone, because as you start thinking about, oh, maybe I should check my messages or YouTube or whatever, you get anticipatory dopamine, which makes you want to check your phone even more. Now, the second part to this is that dopamine can also have this rebound effect where after the release of dopamine, there's an initial little drop in dopamine straight after, which is what then makes your brain and your body want to get another hit of dopamine, which is usually what's happened when you find yourself just aimlessly scrolling through your phone, opening, closing, and reopening the same apps over and over, looking for something new. That's because your brain is pursuing another dopamine release. And then we have the third part to this, which is what I would call the accumulated dopamine fatigue. So basically your brain keeps producing it as you're scrolling through Instagram Reels or something. And each time you find something that's entertaining, you get a little release. But then if you continue doing that without allowing the rebound to come back, you basically are slowly digging yourself into this hole, and you've kind of used up some of that natural dopamine motivation. And so I know this all sounds pretty depressing, but it's actually not, because hidden within this depressing message of our dopamine addicted brains is a pretty cool feature, and that's the fact that dopamine is the anti-boredom molecule. And so dopamine is like that friend that just cannot stand silence and just has to make a noise. I'm kind of surprised that I've never really heard anyone talk about this before, because to me it's just it's almost like a clickbaity type of idea. It's like, to be more productive, do nothing. But it also makes sense if we look back at the dopamine system. And so the idea here is just that you take advantage of that system. And the way that you do that is that you basically just set one rule for yourself. You're allowed to do absolutely nothing, or the thing that you need to do. So you're allowed to just sit and stare into space for as long as you want, but you're not allowed to do anything else than that or the thing that you need to do. And you don't have to do what you need to, but you're not allowed to do anything else. And I know this might sound like complete bullshit, and I think that would be for two reasons that I could think of that you might be thinking of right now. And the first one is that you might be thinking that, well, that just sounds amazing. I'll just sit and stare into space and think and do nothing. I'll get absolutely nothing done because I can do that all day. The second thing is that you might be thinking that, well, if I can get myself to do nothing, then that's about as hard as actually getting myself to do the work. So I might as well do the work. It's like kind of a non-advice because it's almost like telling a drowning person, well, just swim up to the surface and breathe, and then you'll live. If they were able to do that, they probably wouldn't be drowning. And so I think that the second question here is almost answered by the first question, which is that it is actually easier to do nothing than to do the work. Most people, at least me, I find it a little bit almost alluring to think of the fact that, well, I'm allowed to not do the work. I can just sit here and I can do nothing. I don't have to start, I can just do nothing. So I think that it is easier to actually do nothing than to do the work. And for the first question of, well, I can just sit here all day and that will be super enjoyable. From my own experience, having tried this, it is enjoyable. But what happens is that as I'm sitting there doing nothing, it's really interesting what comes out of this nothingness, because I might be able to sit there for a minute, 2 minutes, 3 minutes, 5 minutes and do nothing. But pretty soon my brain just starts working and I just come up with these ideas for the work that I need to do, and I start almost getting excited about the work. It's almost like I can feel what I imagine to be the release of dopamine as anticipatory dopamine, because I'm anticipating the work that I'm about to do and the reward that I will get from having done that work. And I can't really explain that in any other way than you just have to try that. And I'm making this entire video because I think this is such an insight that I've had myself, which is that just doing nothing for a while will get you excited to do the work that you need to do. And this is such a simple thing too, but at the same time, it is so hard to do. Or in the words of Jim Rohn,
I tend to be a little philosophical. Here it is. The things that are easy to do are also easy not to do.
and so I think that dopamine detoxes are really just trying to tackle the age-old instinct of us as humans, which is to just avoid being bored. And if you think back to the Stone Age, which I'm sure that you remember just as well as I do, imagine how bored someone must have been to come up with the fact that you can rub sticks together and it will create fire. Because if you think about it, that person who started doing that did not know that rubbing sticks together would create fire. All that they know is that they were probably super bored and didn't want to chill with Og, Glog, and Sog in the sun. Now, if my memory works correctly, that's probably not how that happened, but still, it doesn't really matter. I think it illustrates the point that I'm trying to make. And in general, the point that I'm trying to make is just that I think we'd all be surprised by how little things have actually changed and how far back we can actually go and still recognize the day-to-day struggles of most people. Maybe we're not that different after all. Now, having said that, I do think that phone use is the biggest dopamine drainer today. And so the biggest part of my boredom strategy has been focused on phone use and how to limit that for myself. And so my strategy is essentially just put the phone down. That's what I'm telling myself constantly. So I'm trying to get into this habit of, as soon as I find myself aimlessly doing something on my phone, I just put my phone down and do nothing. So again, same as with the other strategy, it's just I'm allowed to do nothing, but I'm not allowed to pick up my phone. I'm not allowed to go back on there. I'm also allowed to do any sort of work that I need to do. And that's something that I think is very hard to do, because most of us kind of pick up our phones on autopilot, and most of the time I might not even realize that I've picked up my phone. And so it might take a bit of time before I realize it, and I'm just trying to get into the habit of realizing it, and then as soon as I do, just put it down and sit and do nothing. And it works really well. It's kind of scary how well that actually works, because it makes you realize how much time you're wasting looking at your phone and how much your phone is actually affecting my daily mood and overall happiness in general. So I don't know if this makes any sense to you at all, but even if it doesn't, I really implore you and wish, my purpose for this entire video is just that, to get someone to try this, because to me it's the biggest idea that I've found that it's actually helped increase both my overall well-being as well as my productivity. The fact that you're allowed to do nothing, I feel like, gives this false sense of easiness to it. It makes it feel like, I'm allowed to do nothing, so I won't do anything. So it kind of takes away some of that. It lowers the barrier for the obstacle that you need to pass in order to get started on the work that you need to do. Because you trick your brain into thinking that, you're just going to be doing nothing. But then as you do nothing, you get excited and get ideas for the work that you need to do. And so then you start doing something that was hard. It's a strange thing. I really tried to make this video make sense and really tried my best to make it so that you can actually, to really get my point across. And because I really want you to try this, and I really want to emphasize how genuinely I believe that this is a good idea. Now, maybe you don't need to spend months alone at sea like the 19th century Joshua Slocum did, but maybe we can take some of the lessons that he learned from the boredom that he experienced and bring them into the 21st century.
Caffeinate. I can't think of any dopamine.